Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Good afternoon.
That's very loud.
Or good morning, I should say, perhaps to some of us. Thank you for joining us at the 78th Annual Conference of World Affairs. My name is Benjamin Teitelbaum. I'm an associate professor of musicology and international affairs here at CU Boulder. I'm also the faculty director of the Conference of World Affairs, and it's a pleasure to be serving you today as your moderator. For recording purposes, today's date is Thursday, April 16th, 2026. It is 12:33 p.m. And the title of our panel this afternoon is The Midterms and Beyond, Will They Be Free and Fair? Now, before I get started, I would like to read the University of Colorado Boulder's land acknowledgement. The University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. And while the University of Colorado can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Thank you. Once again, welcome to CWA and today's discussion. We ask that all our attendees remain respectful throughout this discussion and refrain from interruptions. Signs, banners, noisemakers, and other audible disruptions are not permitted and will result in those responsible being asked to leave the room. Please also, similarly, silence your phones. Time cards will be allotted for questions. Time will be allotted for questions from our in-person audience today. And by the way, we are welcoming an online audience. We will take your questions via handwritten note cards. Please raise your hand during our session if you have a question, and our producer will hand you a note card and a pencil. Can I ask our producers in the room to please identify themselves, raise their hands? You can see them. They'll be walking around throughout our session. Please print legibly, and then raise your hand when you have completed your card, and a producer will collect it and bring it to me. We have a very, very distinguished panel for today. All of them could command a long introduction on their own, but I will invite them to introduce themselves briefly, and I will start to my immediate left.
Thank you. It is a pleasure to be here, and I'm so delighted to see so many people who are here and interested in free and fair elections. I'm Ellen Weintraub. I served for many years on the Federal Election Commission, was elected chair for 2025 until I was fired by the president.
Okay, it's hard to follow that. I can't believe I'm on this panel. It's such a distinguished group of experts. But my name is Natasha Lindstedt. I'm a professor of government at the University of Essex, which is outside of London, and my expertise is in authoritarian regimes and autocratization.
It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Parker Poling. I'm a political consultant who provides guidance to political organizations and donors. I spent about 15 years as a chief of staff on Capitol Hill and ran one of the campaign committees that helps elect members to Congress.
Hi, everyone. To echo Ellen's sentiments, it's amazing to see so many people interested in this topic. My name is Devin Gray. I'm the president of an advocacy organization called End Poverty in California. My background is in national and state campaigns, political campaigns, and I also worked in the administration of Governor Gavin Newsom in California.
Thank you all for those introductions. I would like to open things up with a quick exchange about content. We can, as we look forward to the midterm elections, talk about the horse race, who's going to win, who's going to lose. There are contravailing headwinds, there are crosswinds suggesting different outcomes. On the one hand, the party that is out of power oftentimes does quite well in a midterm election. On the other hand, the composition, the arrangement of the electoral map, and the district lines that have been drawn and redrawn in various states might work against a somewhat predictable and standard outcome. There are reasons, in other words, for Democrats and Republicans to perhaps feel optimistic or pessimistic about their chances to the fall. But politics is about more than simply winning or losing. It is the content in the political campaigns that perhaps matters most to us. What sorts of changes are going to be implemented if X party wins or loses? And I'd like to direct my opening question to Parker. Let's put ourselves in the minds of, let's say, the MAGA base. They're looking at President Trump right now, who has initiated this generally unpopular war in Iran. They're seeing some of the principles of the America First platform being thrown into question, perhaps violated, if we want to speak in less euphemistic terms. What would they be hoping for in a renewed agenda after the midterms were things to go their way?
I think I should give a brief disclaimer that I am far from a spokesperson for the MAGA base, but I will say that I think some of the reports about a fissure between the most hardcore Republican voters and the president are overstated. Polling shows that this war is very popular among the 25 to 35% of the population that is strongly MAGA. This president can do no wrong to that group of voters. So I think that they will stay loyal to the president. I think there's a much larger question of how many of them vote, because they are really drawn, there's a core group of voters that are really drawn to the Republican Party because of President Trump. And as much as he is actually saying this, to the contrary, he is not on the ballot. And they are going to be voting for members of Congress, governors, senators who are not named Donald Trump. And so I think you will see a fall off among those hardcore MAGA voters in terms of turnout. But in terms of policy, they are really still largely aligned with the president.
Devin, in 2024, Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez made, I think, a quite astute piece of commentary on one of Donald Trump's most successful TV ads. There was a TV ad, he was commenting on trans rights campaigns, and at the end of the ad, there was a quick little phrase where he said, "She is for they, them, he is for you." And many people were drawing attention to the way this seemed to implicate and target trans people, but AOC said, don't be distracted by the noise. Pay attention to the signal here. What Donald Trump was saying is that he is on your side and he's going to fight for your interests. It was actually a creative way of saying, I'm on behalf of the people. And the problem that she brought up was that the Democrats seemed to not have a real message and a real vision for who they were fighting for, why, and on what basis. Mm-hmm. Has that changed today? If the Democrats win the election, the midterm election, do they have a platform, a clear, coherent mission for their cause?
I think the answer is sort of a yes and a no on that. I think there are some individual candidates who I think are running really strong people-centered campaigns. I think Mary Peltola in Alaska has like a really coherent message. I think Tallarico in Texas has a pretty coherent message as well. But I think the structural challenge that Democrats have in our national electorate is that we are a massive tent, right? And I think it is very difficult for us, though I think we need to be better at it, at having a coherent message that is applicable to the range of constituencies that we have to speak to in order to cobble together a majority. I also think that it's sort of goes without saying that midterm elections are sort of infrequently about the party out of power. It is a referendum on the party that is in power. So it may not be electorally necessary for Democrats to have a coherent message other than opposition to Republicans who are in power. And I think that is useful maybe in the short term, but I do think that that creates challenges in the long term. And I think particularly in a national election coming up in 2 years, an absence of a coherent message that is people-centered, worker-centered, unifying, if we can achieve that. Not having that and not being able to really start to implement that in 2026, I think, is a potential weak spot in our national electoral strategy. Will it cause bad consequences in this midterm election? Probably not. I think chances are Democrats take back the House, have, despite the structural disadvantages of the Senate apportionment, have, a small chance of being able to at least make it 50-50, maybe 51 seats. But nonetheless, I think that the Senate strategy is relying on the individual quality of some of our candidates in some of these swing states. Let's not forget Sherrod Brown's also running a fairly strong campaign to get a seat back in Ohio. Nonetheless, I don't think we're seeing the message discipline from DSCC or DTRIP. We're seeing it from the campaigns themselves. And to the extent that they are sort of parallel in their messaging, that's great, but I don't think it's coming from a centralized source.
Can I ask, how many of you are concerned about the fairness of upcoming elections here in the United States? Ellen. This kind of answers the question since your hand was up, but is that unease justified?
Absolutely. And I think we all need to maintain our vigilance, and that's how we will secure a free and fair election. It won't be perfect. No election is ever perfect. And I think there have been, and will continue to be attempts to suppress the vote in certain parts of the population. And the way to counteract that is that there are a lot of people out there, a lot of good lawyers out there, a lot of good organizations out there that are watching very closely, are bringing lawsuits. I think I remain cautiously optimistic that judges will stand up for the rights of the people. But this president has tried twice to issue executive orders declaring himself the king of elections. This is completely unconstitutional. It didn't work last year. It was largely his first administrative order on elections was largely overturned by the courts, and I don't think he even challenged that. And the one that he issued most recently is again under being litigated almost immediately. A number of groups and organizations filed lawsuits, which I am optimistic will be successful at overturning the executive order. The Constitution gives the time, place, and manner of elections as the jurisdiction of the states, not the federal government. Congress can write laws. There is no role for the president in running our elections in our Constitution, and I think the courts will uphold that. But we have to remain vigilant. As I said, the reason why I am cautious, as I raise my hand, I am concerned. The reason that I'm cautiously optimistic is because I know how many people are paying very close attention and are prepared to jump to court on a moment's notice. But that's really. It really shouldn't be that way. I'll defer to my colleague on how other democracies have failed across the world, but that we in the United States of America, going into our 250th year, have to worry about whether we're going to have a free and fair election is pretty darn depressing. I will say that I see very little prospect of the SAVE Act passing, which is good news. And as I said, I think the executive order is probably going to be overturned.
If I can briefly stick with you, Ellen, can we put that in concrete terms? What specifically concerns you? What sorts of actions are you asking us all to be vigilant about and to look out for?
Well, I think it is illegal to send troops into polling places. But I would not put it past this administration to try to send ICE agents or troops in the vicinity of polling stations to try and intimidate voters. And I think that we need to stand up for our neighbors and to come out in force. I would recommend that anybody who can volunteer to do either to be a poll worker or to do election protection work. There's a lot of good nonpartisan organizations who are organizing folks. You don't have to be a lawyer. They will train you. You can, help people over the phone who run into problems trying to exercise their right to vote. So I think we will see a lot of things happen in the run-up to elections, and and by the way, the Supreme Court seems poised. Don't want to predict, but they seem to be inclined to say to change the terms of when mail-in ballots would be counted. They seem like they're heading towards saying that it would have to be received by Election Day. So make sure, those of you who vote by mail, that you get your votes in early. I think there's a lot that we can do as citizens, not only to make sure that we vote and that we encourage all of our friends to get out and vote, but that we help to protect our neighbors' right to vote.
And Natasha, Ellen mentioned that certainly what's going on in our country right now can always be viewed in an international context. In what ways does our experience parallel or not parallel that of, let's say, an explicitly authoritarian regime?
Good question. The first one that comes to mind, of course, is Hungary, and that's why what happened in Hungary a few days ago was so astonishing. Yeah, it is. Viktor Orban was one of the architects of Project 2025, and he's one of the leaders that we think about when we talk about autocratic legalism. And that is a type of electoral irregularity that's called electoral malpractice. This is the strategic manipulation of the legal framework. So this is something that happens before Election Day, and it's where you manipulate the laws or you change the laws, so it's all legal, but you get an unfair advantage to the incumbent or to a specific party. The playing field is not fair. It's all legal, but it's not fair. So when we think about this, we think of gerrymandering, that's the distortion of votes, distorting how votes translate into seats. And to give you an example of what happened in Hungary with the Fidesz party, which is why the recent victory of the opposition was so astounding, was that in 2010, Fidesz had 52% of the votes and they roughly had 52% of the seats. In 2014, they got 45% of the votes, so they went down by 8 points, and they suddenly got 66% of the seats. They had like 2/3 of the seats. So that can show you the dangers of gerrymandering. And so, we have issues of gerrymandering. We have other types of electoral irregularities, whether it be electoral manipulation. We heard about this a lot in the 2016 election. This is something also that was going on in Hungary as well, where there is an attempt to use social media to spread misinformation about other candidates, about other parties, to sow doubt. We had actually touched upon this in another panel, but I'll repeat it, that in Hungary, it has the lowest level of migration of any country in Europe, and yet Viktor Orban was spreading, and his party was spreading through social media, that there were migrants coming and they were engaging in all kinds of crime and violence, and they were taking over jobs. And so this is something that could be technically legal, but you're affecting the way people vote, and you're affecting how people vote, or if people vote, I should say. And so I'm concerned about this with the US election, that there could be information spread or misinformation spread on social media to Hispanic voters, trying to depress them from voting, trying to discourage them from voting, maybe affecting newly naturalized citizens. I'm not necessarily worried about the type of electoral fraud that you might see in a dictatorship like Belarus, where every single election, Alexander Lukashenko wins with 80% of the votes. I don't know how he always does it with 80%, but he somehow figures it out. And that's that illegal interference with the electoral outcome, where they specify exactly how much is going to happen, how much votes they're going to get. I'm more worried about these other things, these things of manipulation, intimidation, purging people off of voter rolls. That's a tactic that you really don't see in democracies at all. And I've heard that that's a potential problem for newly naturalized citizens. So prior to the recent thing that happened in Hungary, I was worried that the US was going to become something like Hungary. I'm really, really closely watching what happens in the 2026 elections to see to what extent Trump gets involved, to see if they accept the results, and to see if really the votes translate in the polls reflect what ends up happening in the amount of seats that the parties get. Thanks.
Can I ask, though, we've heard gerrymandering referenced a couple times, just this practice of redrawing congressional districts so that it favors one party over another. That practice has been deemed legal, has it not? And so if gerrymandering is legal, should we be speaking about it as though it were some act of lawlessness, some defiance of a legal order, and some step toward authoritarianism?
Absolutely. The fact that the Supreme Court is willing to turn a blind eye to a technique that is being used to undermine the democracy doesn't mean that we shouldn't be out in the streets demanding better. The problem with gerrymandering is that you can have that kind of result where, and we've seen this in a number of our states where they're purple states, they're sort of 50-50. Maybe you've seen this sort of thing happening in Colorado. I know we've seen it in North Carolina and other states where, despite the fact that you've got a sort of 50-50 state, somehow there's a supermajority in the state legislature, and then they draw the federal district lines, and you end up with a misrepresentative Congress. So I'm a lawyer, but I don't think that we should stop at what the Supreme Court has said or what laws are written. If we want better laws, then we should advocate for better laws that would give us a better democracy.
Completely agree. Just very quickly, things can be legal, but they might not be democratic. And that's why it's autocratic legalism.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of beating a dead horse at this point. I think it's important to talk about gerrymandering, but of course, it was perfectly legal to deny the right to vote to women until the 19th Amendment. It was, perfectly legal to have poll taxing and literacy tests at polls prior to the Voting Rights Act, so on and so forth. We talk, with total understanding that Citizens United has made corporate speech, you can spend unlimited amounts of money in elections now, and that doesn't deny the importance of understanding how that distorts electoral outcomes. So, yeah, I think most people here understand that there is a pretty big chasm between legality and democratic principles.
I mean, this is a little bit provocative, but if 60% of California voters voted in favor of a very gerrymandered map where, 40% of the voters voted for Donald Trump and they have 5 of the 50 some odd seats, doesn't that make gerrymandering inherently democratic?
I should probably respond to this as the Californian on the panel, of course. You're all familiar with Prop 50 from last November in California. Basically, it was Governor Newsom's response to Texas's gerrymandering, which saw Republicans gain 5 seats, right? I think in many ways, and this isn't just because I used to work for the guy, I do think that California actually exercised a bit of restraint. We could have gerrymandered more, but we could have had plus 8 if we really divided up the votes in Los Angeles and the Bay Area. So I do think that tit-for-tat gerrymandering is a little bit different than proactive gerrymandering.
What we are talking about in this case, though, is, correct me if I'm wrong, is a sort of norm of our political life and our political culture that we don't actually gerrymander in this way and this blatantly. And that norm has died, and in its place there's nothing to stop these actions, whether or not it is the tit or the tat. Do we need more laws? Is the problem that we don't have a sufficiently regulated political system?
I would say on the gerrymandering front in particular, what we need is a national law, because you can't do it state. We've seen this year is a great example of what happens when you do it state by state. One state is aggressive, and then another state says, well, we have to respond to that because we don't want our party to be disadvantaged if the other side is the only ones who are going to be doing the gerrymandering. So then everybody's gerrymandering, and it gets kind of ugly, and I don't think anybody should be happy with this result, but the only way to change that is to do it with a national law, which Congress could pass, almost passed a few years back and didn't quite make it through. But it's got to be done across the country, otherwise you're never going to get out of this tit-for-tat fighting.
Just a quick note of that. We tried to do that in California. We set up an independent redistricting commission that has equal representation of Democrats, Republicans, and independents on it. We tried to do the right thing, but you can't be a solo actor in that move, right, like to Ellen's point. So while I think states can try to model good, fair democratic practices that are nonpartisan in nature, if you are, if you're the sole mover on that front, you're always going to have to respond, which is unfortunate. And I think if you were to poll Californians 2 years ago prior to Texas's gerrymandering, most people would have been very opposed to what took place with Prop 50, but it was responsive, right? So yes, national redistricting, please.
This somewhat points us to some of the student questions. How many students do we have in the room? Just curious to see. All right. I'm especially proud as a Nederland local. I think Nederland High School is represented in the room. Is that true? All right. A lot of the comments from the students relate to the outcome of the election. On the other side, let's suppose, in fact, there is a free and fair vote. One question is, will people concede if they lose races? Alternately, let's suppose the Democrats win. Do they have any actual power to change things or to address this particular issue that we've been discussing these past 10 minutes about redistricting? Could they actually do it?
Probably not, because the president would veto it.
I mean, ultimately, in order to do something like a national gerrymander, what the Supreme Court said, and I would never presume to tell Ellen Weintraub about election law, but what the Supreme Court said is they want it resolved by the political process, and that means voters need to, vote for people who would vote for this legislation. They need to elect a president. If that is truly what the will of the people is, to have fairer maps, then that is now left to the political process, which is the people in this room.
Never a lot of applause if it's put on our shoulders, right? So it could be up to us, but there's a certain dynamic here in this conversation that strikes me, that one side of our political spectrum, the right in this case, makes an action. And Devin, this is not to play favorites, but I'll just take your description of how things have taken place. The Republicans have an initiative, they take an initiative to do something, and then the Democrats react to it. And they may play a game of tit for tat, maybe they'll try to clean up the mess. But again, there's this question facing the Democrats, well, what are your initiatives? What are the things that the Democrats are going to do that the Republicans then would feel that they would have to respond to in some way? This has come up in a couple of questions from the audience. Why should we trust the Democrats? They don't do anything anyways.
I don't disagree. Look, there was a Democratic trifecta going into 2021. Theoretically, there could have been legislation passed to ban gerrymandering. Theoretically, you could have even gone so far as to make DC and Puerto Rico states. It's 4 more senators. I mean, if you really want to game the system, that's how you would have done it. I think the problem is that, to get back to the point of the Big Tent, there's a lot of political diversity, or at least there was back in 2021. Some people stopped identifying as Democrats and thinking of a certain senator from West Virginia, of course, another senator from Arizona as well. That said, that is a problem for the Democratic base, obviously, when we do our part, show up, vote, knock doors, make phone calls, donate money. because we see that there are distortions that are taking place in the electoral system. And then when we actually achieve the electoral results, that would give us the opportunity to try to make the system fairer and more balanced, and people don't take advantage of that. Democratic leaders don't take advantage of that opportunity. It does obviously diminish trust in the party as an institution, and by extension, the actual bodies of governance as institutions. And we talk a lot about voter apathy and civic education and how do we get people off the sidelines. I think there is a point of friction that takes place when folks internalize a narrative that has been sort of rationally concluded that your participation in the system doesn't yield actual desired outcomes. And it's not just from, you don't get your preferred policy choices, preferred policy outcomes, but also the structural distortions that we're all aware of, the gerrymandering that takes place, the money in politics, the way that Senate seats are apportioned in this country, where Wyoming has 600,000 people and gets 2 senators, and California has 40 million and we have 2 senators. People see that as meaningfully distorting desired policy outcomes, and that undermines the legitimacy of the process. So I think if Democrats get the chance to do it again, we have to make sure that we're underscoring the fact that the system can be made more legitimate and get people off the sidelines as a result.
Now, Natasha brought up the elections in Hungary and this somewhat surprising landslide victory for Peter Magyar. In that case, we saw the same electoral system, the same, we could even say, if we want to paint in broad strokes, the same gerrymandered map of Hungary in this case, that was used to support the existing political establishment in the past, suddenly turned against them. Is there any scenario in which, let's say, the moves by the Republicans in Texas or the Democrats in California could plausibly come to bite them in the back? How would that work?
There's a phenomenon that's sometimes called dummy-mandering, where if whoever is drawing the lines, if they get too aggressive, they eliminate some safer seats and make them more marginal. They think they'll have enough to get over the line, but if it's too close and you get a wave election that goes the other way, suddenly a bunch of those districts could flip. So yes, I think people can outsmart themselves. I think that some of the suggestions that have been made to reduce mail-in voting, for example, could really affect rural voters and a lot of Trump voters, frankly. A lot of hardcore Republicans are going to be disadvantaged by some of these rules that the Republican Party is advocating for. I think that they may well be shooting themselves in the foot. And it may be, the Democrats may be doing the Republicans a favor by getting in the way of their adopting some of the more extreme proposals.
No, I absolutely agree with Ellen. I was in a room with party officials during the 2020 cycle in which they would come in and say, no, we got the president back in the right place. He's going to stop talking about mail-in voting and early voting. We got him. It's set. I'm like, clearly not. He really believes this, but it is not actually the position of the party at large. It is Donald Trump's belief that mail-in voting is bad, and I think it will disadvantage Republican voters who are often older and are more rural. And just to Ellen's dummy-mandering point, I don't think any of these maps quite get to that level, but Devin mentioned that that Republicans are going to pick up 5 seats in Texas. I actually don't think that's the case. I think it's more likely 3. Two of the seats were drawn. They are heavily Hispanic, and yes, a lot of Hispanics voted for Donald Trump in the 2024 election. I don't think Republicans should make the mistake of believing that Hispanics are a rock-solid Republican voting bloc. So I think a lot of those voters are swing voters, and they are, going to react to the president's policies and swing the other direction. So I think that the lines are not as clear as they seem.
Another type of interference and phenomena that can weaken the legitimacy of an election, of course, is foreign influence. There hasn't been a lot of conversation about that since the 2016 election, when, of course, there was a great deal of concern and investigation surrounding a potential Russian insertion of itself and influence in our elections. Is there any concern for foreign influence today? And in that case, where would it be coming from?
I think there absolutely should be concern about this, and I think that maybe it's out of the headlines, but I don't think that it's out of the range of possibilities that people who are, in the weeds on these issues are looking at. We've had myriad government reports from bipartisan, the Senate Intelligence Committee, which was under bipartisan leadership, from Trump, in the first Trump administration, from the Department of Homeland Security and from the Department of Justice, that demonstrated that the Russians absolutely did try to interfere in previous elections. I have no doubt they will continue to try to do so, as well as the Iranians, the Chinese, the Israelis, you name it. There's any number of countries out there that are going to try and seed disinformation and misinformation into our political debate. We've seen it before, we'll see it again. Also, because we have, thanks to the Supreme Court, corporate money in our elections, it is very hard to see behind the corporations as to who is funding them. That is true of some of these 501c4 organizations that are active in elections, but it can also, foreign money can also come in through business corporations that then donate to super PACs. So I think that and by the way, the president has disabled some of the units in the government that used to specifically look at these issues and try and address potential foreign disinformation coming obviously from abroad, from mostly from governments, but also could be from other foreign actors. So I think that there definitely will be attempts by foreign governments to try and interfere with our elections. Will they be meaningful and successful? I think this is I'm almost more concerned about the disinformation and misinformation that's coming from inside the House, that's coming domestically, but I think we all have to be very savvy consumers, particularly of what we're reading online.
I'll just add something. No, I completely agree with that. I mean, just because the media isn't reporting on it doesn't mean that it's not happening. The Russians are highly involved in elections in Romania, in Ukraine, or before the conflict started, in France, in the UK, in Georgia, the country, and of course in the US. I mean, they are supporting far-right groups, hoping to sow discord. It's a form of sharp power. It's been incredibly effective. They have a full effort going into trying to shape hearts and minds, manipulate, sow discord, confuse. Some of it is just about providing almost an overwhelming amount of information that it creates apathy. Sometimes it's about stoking polarization, stoking extremism. The micro-targeting has only improved and increased. So I have no doubt that this will be a big issue that we'll be dealing with as normal, but I would agree with Ellen that part of the problem is that there's just so much misinformation, or disinformation, I should say, coming from Trump himself and from Fox News and some of these other outlets, that if you have at least, at least half of the population hearing completely different sets of facts, it becomes really difficult to debate in pragmatic and effective manner.
From 2018 to 2022, I spent most of my time following Steve Bannon around. I wrote a book about this. So Ellen said sorry to hear that. Her mic wasn't on. So just. And one thing, am I allowed to swear at CWA? I'm glad you also, well, it is kind of my, he used to say, flood the zone with shit. And what he meant by that was create a media environment or a sort of frenzy among his political opponents that involved so many stressors, that introduced so many points of anxiety to someone's worldview that they just became disoriented and couldn't actually function. It seems I see a lot of nodding heads. It's like, yeah, that's me. Yeah, he got me. It was a theory, and I think about that when I hear what you're saying. I think about it also when I'm reading a group of actually student questions to us that have less to do with the technicalities and legalities of voting systems and more with how one lives a good life as a citizen in a democratic society. One student asks, what criteria should a young voter use to evaluate a president's performance? Cole. A second student says, do debates actually help voters make decisions or reinforce what they already think? And another question asked, what can we do to combat disinformation campaigns, especially considering that large social media platforms in this country are speculated to have MAGA money impacting their algorithms? I'll let anyone on the panel take any one of those questions they'd like.
I think I just want to say that I think that disinformation and misinformation and foreign influence is a bipartisan problem. And I think we should not be in a trap of thinking that every foreign government wants to help Republicans win. I think we all need to be as responsible, small d, democratic citizens, vigilant. And there is left-wing disinformation also. And so, I try and read multiple sources. I do trust the New York Times. I also trust the Wall Street Journal. I think being an informed citizen is reading widely and broadly in potentially even reading something you disagree with occasionally. But I think, trying to have a varied media diet is a really important practice.
100% agree.
Well, I think to the question for young people who are trying to evaluate the president's performance, I think it's probably multifactored, like for all of us. I don't think it's ever one metric. I think there's the obvious one of, do you feel like you have more optimism for your long-term trajectory, economically, socially, as a citizen in whatever way that needs to be? I think that's like the personal one. Do you see your communities being stronger or weaker? And do you like the direction the country is going? And if the answer falls on one side, I think you sort of have your ideas formed as to whether the president's doing a good job. But I do think it's never just one thing, right? And the way that voters make up their mind over who they like and who they don't like is complex. And if it was simple, I think we'd all be out of a job, right?
I'm going to answer the question about how you tackle disinformation. So because Finland and Estonia border Russia, they actually started a campaign, an education campaign to tackle disinformation a long time ago, after Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014. So it's been going on over a decade, and the campaign is about media literacy, trying to identify disinformation, trying to understand it, and it is embedded. They don't just have one class on it. It is embedded into all the classes, how you can discern better information, how you can distinguish between fake news and accurate information, how you identify sources, and so forth. These are one suggestion I think that can be helpful. Another one I'm just going to put out there, not to advocate for it, but just to say what it is. In Germany, they have laws that if there is some sort of false information by a social media platform, they will be fined if it is not taken down within 24 hours. I think there are a lot of things that we can do. I know there are a lot of use of big data and machine learning, which in the past had been used to sort of spread disinformation, but now to identify disinformation and try to fact check. There's a lot going on about tackling this because I think it was the World Economic Forum that identified disinformation as one of the biggest threats to global stability.
Anyone else on how to identify the good performance of a president? It was surprisingly simple, but I also thought kind of deceptively difficult.
I think, you have to look at whether the policies of the administration benefit you, whether, I keep thinking about that ad, which offended me on various levels, but I know it was very effective. He's for you. And I think every voter has to look at the performance of the administration, and I would humbly suggest look at issues like corruption and self-dealing, which as an old-time ethics person, I think it's just the self-dealing in this administration is completely unprecedented. I would look at those issues and ask whether that is an indication that the administration is in it for themselves or in it for the typical voter.
going to add one thing. I also would be really interested to see who they surround themselves with. Are they surrounding themselves with experts? What kind of decisions are they making? Yeah. Are they surrounding themselves with the best people? And I think you can draw the conclusion there.
What are you all laughing about? Okay. Here are a couple questions that seem interrelated to me. By the way, thank you for these questions. I don't think I've ever gotten this many questions this quickly ever in a CWA panel, which is a good thing, but you're making me nervous too. One person asks, is it possible for a moderate to win the midterm or any election now? Most of us want a moderate, most of us want cooperation, and yet it seems that this gerrymandering, or let's say redistricting, I'd like to use more neutral language, this redistricting makes moderation and compromise a sort of liability. Another person says, this room is partisan. No, we all live in our silos and speak to our own choirs. How can the right and the left actually have meaningful discourse?
I'll take that. I live on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. My precinct voted 93% for Kamala Harris. I think if you don't want to live in a bubble, you have to be deliberate about not living in a bubble. I asked my in-laws, who are staunch Democrats, if they were friends with anyone who is a Republican, and they said, you. And I said, I don't count. I married your son. You didn't choose me. I don't think this is going to get better unless people make deliberate choices to see the other side to see other people's perspective. I truly believe that a lot of a lot of Republicans are honest and sincere. I believe that Democrats are honest and sincere in their beliefs. I don't think they want the country to go to hell. I think they are acting in a way that they think benefits them. And so if that's an important thing to you, I would encourage you to seek out people who disagree with you and have honest, non-emotional conversations with them.
100% agree again. And I would encourage you, when you're doing that, to start by listening and not, when we say talk to people of different political views, maybe listen to people of political views. Listen first and talk second. I also want to point out that gerrymandering affects the House, but not the Senate. So I think that there is room for a moderate to win, certainly in Senate races, particularly in some of the swing states. And I would encourage everyone. I mean, I gather this is a pretty politically involved group in the room, but I would encourage everyone to vote in primaries, because that is where you get the extreme candidates, because only the most ardent voters turn out in primaries. The rate of participation in primary elections is really shockingly low. So when we're advocating that everybody should vote in every election, vote in the primaries, get your friends out to vote in the primaries, because that's how you affect who the candidates will be. And if you want to have more moderate candidates running, if you want to have a choice between more moderate candidates, you have to get them past the primaries first.
Yeah. Just to echo those points, I think moderates can and have absolutely found success. And given the way that, if you're a state that's trying to gerrymander, it's sort of in your interest to not have your partisan population packed into a single district, because that's not an efficient allocation of votes, right? So if you're trying to gerrymander, which I don't think any of us love, but if that's the strategy, you're actually setting up districts for moderates to have a bit more success if you're doing the math right. But there are also things in reforms that states and local jurisdictions have done that I think also do help get consensus candidates elected more. In California, we have very controversial, but sometimes popular jungle primary system, where it's a nonpartisan primary and the top 2 vote getters of any party move on to the November election. So it ensures that the candidate that wins, and this is the case for all of our federal races and all the statewide races, get a majority of the vote in the November election. And so what ends up happening is if you have 2 Democrats in California, there is an incentive for Republican voters to choose the candidate that's closer to them. In some local jurisdictions, we have ranked choice voting, and that is oftentimes very confusing for people, and it yields sometimes strange outcomes. But in San Francisco, a very progressive city, a relatively moderate mayor was elected despite not having the top votes among people who wanted him as their first choice. So sometimes there are reforms that can yield greater consensus among who actually ends up getting elected. So I do think moderates are not an endangered species, I don't think. I would also say really quick, sorry, I also don't think we have a consensus on what it means to be moderate either. If you ask people what moderation looks like to them, sometimes it's not so much policy as it is affect. And that can be something too. So I don't always know if we agree on what that means.
Moderates? Oh, be very quick. Well, there's some studies that show that moderates are actually really good for democracy. Because polarization is not great, because there's less likely to be tolerance. And that's actually why, just circling back to the question about Russian interference, where they were just trying to stoke polarization, they would never support a moderate candidate, because moderates, it's easier to find some kind of consensus, and tolerance and consensus are incredibly important to democracy to function.
You know what's striking? Just in the last minute, the cards that I've been getting in, a lot of them from students have put forward really the opposite perspective and the opposite sentiment of what we just heard. How many of you went to the debate on Monday night between Susan Rice and John Bolton? Diehard CWA attendees, I love to see that. One refrain that came out from that debate between a meeting between this, of course, former Bush official and former Obama official was, wow, they agreed on so very much. Right? And didn't we used to think that Bush versus Obama, that really mapped the entire expanse of the political spectrum? And yet here they seem so close. A lot of the comments that I just got from students said, well, the parties are so close to each other. The differences are not meaningful, in fact. Moderates and centrism is not what we need. I actually want a contrast. Is there room for that in your visions for the future? Is that something that we need?
I think that is something that we hear on my side of the aisle, especially from sort of activists. They call it the uniparty, where there is a belief that it is the entire government is run by corporate elites. And I think it is especially prevalent among young voters that there is not a difference. My view is that because of the way the Constitution is set up, the way our electoral system is set up, that we are inherently a two-party country. It's in part because the legislature is a majority-run institution. The two parties, you talked about having a very big tent. I think we also have a big tent. It's because there are really only two parties, and so you are encompassing a vast range of political views within one side or the other. So, I think the extremes are quite extreme, but within, you could find people in each party that are very close to each other.
I think, as somebody who spends a lot of time in the weeds, that there are vast differences in the agendas of the two different parties, in the kind of people they appoint to the judiciary, for example. I think there are striking differences in that regard, in the kind of people that get appointed to cabinet secretaries and other positions as well, but I think it's most striking in the judiciary. But I also think, and I would be remiss if I, as the campaign finance person on the panel, did not bring this up, that part of this problem that the student has identified is a creature of our campaign finance system. It's a creature of the system that the Supreme Court has handed to us in Citizens United. There are vast, vast sums of money that are donated by billionaires in this country in ways that didn't used to be the case 15 years ago. We've really changed the money and politics system, the court has, and the result is that it makes it much harder for candidates on either side to defy the will of certain very, very well-resourced sectors of the economy. As one example, there's a lot of money right now supporting candidates who will be friendly to the crypto industry. There's a lot of money that is supporting candidates who will commit to not regulating AI in any way. I don't think that's good for the country. I don't think it necessarily reflects what most citizens want, but I think that it does intimidate some candidates and office holders because they know that if they take a position that is strongly on the opposite side of where some of this money is coming from, that there's going to be just a torrent of money thrown at them in the next election. And I think that is a big problem, and it's part of what creates the perception of the uniparty.
You mentioned AI, Ellen, and I also just got a couple questions in about AI in the upcoming elections. How many of you would describe yourselves as AI anxious? You seem to know what I mean by that term. That is to say, you're not entirely confident that the future it might bring will be a good one. Safe definition. Panelists, what role do you think AI will play in this upcoming election? And I'll leave that as open as it can be.
I think it's exactly what I just said. I think it's going to be the money from the AI industry that that will influence whether government can play a role. And I think that, whatever you think about what and I'm not going to try and put forward the ideal AI regulation, but I think there is a role for government, there should be a role for government in addressing this, what has the potential to be an extraordinarily powerful technology that could affect all of our lives. And to say that the government should just take hands off and let these Silicon Valley geniuses decide for themselves what our future is going to look like, I would have to disagree with that.
Totally agree with what Ellen said. I'll go back to what I'd said earlier about the way that artificial intelligence is used to just micro-target voters and to shape. It could be they already have a proclivity in one way, one feeling, and it might move them to the extreme. It sort of can shape their opinions on things, and I find that to be incredibly dangerous, how that affects our free will and how we might not be even aware that this is happening. And the American campaigns are so incredibly long. They're just constantly campaigning, and you're constantly getting political messages and so forth. It's an inundation of information and flooding, as they refer to it, that can confuse voters, bewilder voters, affect their, the way that they might vote or if they might vote, as I mentioned before. Just to contrast that, I live in the UK, the campaigns are only 6 weeks, and it does feel saner in some ways.
Yeah, to touch upon a few of those things, obviously the AI regulation is the Wild West right now. There's no real regulation because of the moneyed interest that Ellen was talking about. We've not yet seen really coordinated misinformation or disinformation campaigns utilizing AI yet, but would any of us be surprised if that happened in the midterms or in the next general election in 2028? I certainly wouldn't be. The other piece that I'm quite worried about AI, and then as a result, the electoral consequences, is that I'm a believer that AI is probably going to be an agent of exacerbating economic inequality, right? And I think that as we see inequality not just persist, but potentially grow over the coming generation, we're going to see political effects to that. We're going to see more volatility in our elections. We're going to see greater amounts of populism that try to speak towards rectifying that inequality, even if there aren't real solutions behind it. So I think there are certainly immediate effects to AI for our elections, but also second and third order effects as well.
Just one quick, I just did fairly recently a poll in Republican congressional districts, and over 80% of Republican voters in these districts wanted AI to be regulated more strictly. I mean, these are people who don't think you should regulate anything. So I do think that there is a bipartisan consensus around this, and that is maybe a moment of hope.
Just to point on, I mean, that's amazing. And yet, the criticism of the uniparty will come back, though, when we see a distortion between something that has 80% Republican and probably similar amounts of Democratic support not be reflected in the policy choices and outcomes because of the moneyed interests that have a stranglehold over our elected officials. Because we know that, OpenAI can cut a huge check to whatever candidate that they want. We're not going to see the reflection of that very universal sentiment in our policy discourse in terms of our policy votes as well.
I know we could keep speaking about that. I'm struck by how multifaceted the concerns about AI are. We're talking about industry lobbying influence, we're talking about the transformation of the economy, we're talking about electoral processes, so on and so forth. But we are in the final 10 minutes of our session today here, unfortunately, and I think that's an opportune moment to ask our panelists to start turning to the future. I don't know how comfortable you all are with prophecy. But what do you think this year's midterm elections are going to be about? What issues are going to be at the top of voters' minds? One of the questions that just came to me was, cards that just came to me was, my issue with this administration is a moral issue, not a Republican or a Democrat issue. Can we get back to decency? In other words, that would suggest that almost foretells an election that is about Donald Trump. What do you think this election is going to be about?
The news cycle is so dynamic that it's hard to predict what's going to be relevant in November. I think if it was held today, when I talk to people, it's concerns over foreign policy, it's concerns over gas prices and the economy more broadly, and the fact that the affordability crisis has not been addressed sufficiently by this administration. I don't think it's going to be a question of whether Democrats can effectively articulate a vision. I think, again, individual candidates can and have already, but I do think it's going to be a referendum on the economy, personally.
Yeah, I mean, historically, midterm elections are not a choice. They're a referendum on the party in power. I totally agree with Devin on that. If you ask voters right now, its affordability is top of mind. You will have to keep in mind that you, the people in this room, are not representative of swing voters. You are all highly, highly engaged. You've probably already decided who you're going to vote for. You are the voters that are going to decide the election are often not very engaged in politics. They're doing other things. They are not really paying attention. They don't know what the Strait of Hormuz is, and that's not meant to be an insult. It's meant to be a reflection of reality. And those voters are going to wake up on election morning or the 2 weeks before and fill up their gas tank, and it's going to be more than it used to be, and they'll vote Democrat. I mean, that's about the level of consideration that most voters put into it.
We going one by one? Okay. I'm just going to I'm going to agree with what's been saying. I mean, the first thing that comes into my head is affordability, and you just keep hearing it again and again that people aren't happy with the cost of living. Just to give you an example, because I keep referring to the fact that I live in the UK, and the first time I moved over there, the prices were so high, I just got sticker shock. I had no idea how they survived there. And now it's the other way around. When I go to the grocery store, I cannot believe how expensive it is. And the president isn't really addressing that. In fact, he's making it worse. Gas prices have been up 30% since the conflict started. And of course, there's going to be pressures on other things like food. With fertilizer, can't get through the Strait of Hormuz. So without the Republicans really addressing these types of issues, unless you're really strongly partisan, you have the biggest block of voters are independent voters, and they're not happy with what's in their pocketbooks.
A student asks, are social issues, in parentheses, the environment, domestic violence, healthcare, LGBTQ plus rights, immigration, etc., are all these electorally irrelevant? I mean, none of you mentioned any of that now. Is that a relic of a bygone political age?
I don't think they're irrelevant. I think every individual goes to the, when they have their ballot in hand or however they're voting, they're going to make their choices based on the issues that are most salient to them. There are single issue voters out there. And I have been a single issue voter in the past, and who knows, maybe again in the future. So they're not, they're salient to who they're salient to. I think when people say affordability and the economy are going to be the big issues, I think those are issues that are going to be salient to a lot of people. That doesn't mean that other issues don't matter. There are plainly issues that affect people's everyday lives that go beyond, whatever the number is at the gas pump. But, when you drive down the street and every block there's that big sign that tells you how high the gas prices are, it's kind of hard to avoid.
Yeah, I would add, I think they are relevant in primaries, but I think if you're a single issue voter on a social issue, you know where your political home is, right? There are very few people who, if you have a strong opinion on abortion or on environmental protections, you know where you're probably voting in a Democrat versus Republican election, right? So I think it's really relevant in primaries, and that's not a bad thing. But I think when we're asking the question of how an election is going to be decided in a November general cross-partisan election, it's the voters who don't have a cleanly defined political home that are going to be the ones who decide where elections go. And so therefore the issues that are relevant narrow significantly for them.
Let's keep our forward-looking gaze active for a few more minutes. A student question, the last question, is will the midterms change either of these parties, and in what way?
I don't know. I probably shouldn't say this, but let's just say, hypothetically speaking, the Republicans did really, really bad. After 2018, for just a moment there, they started to say they needed to dump Trump. Maybe there's a possibility that they'll do that again. I don't know.
Well, I think, as Parker said earlier, there's, and I think this is true of both parties, the base is kind of baked in. So is the base going to change? Maybe not. But does that mean that the parties overall can't change? I think one thing that the MAGA movement did very effectively was to take over the Republican Party. When, starting at the county level, they had a plan for taking over the Republican Party, and they were very effective at it. So what we need are more grassroots activists to take back the county, or to take, not even back, but to move from the bottom up, from the grassroots up, party organizations in different directions. I think the parties will be responsive to where their voters are.
I think 2028 is going to be fascinating because we are going to have two wide open party primaries in a wide open presidential race. No incumbent, which I think it was, the last time was 2012 or 2016. So, it doesn't happen all the time. And I think both parties are going to have to decide whether their path to victory involves motivating their base, which tends to be more extreme, or trying to appeal more to the middle. And that's going to be a conversation that starts probably in November, the day after the election.
I wish that this conversation could continue, but now it's time for me to ask you all to thank our panelists for today. Thank you all. Please stick around at CWA. We have a lot of great activities going on and panels this afternoon. Thank you, everybody.